Settle in now. Let your body grow heavy against whatever is holding you, and let the day, all of it, every sharp edge and rushing moment, begin to soften and drift away. Tonight, we are going to travel a very long way, across an ocean, across centuries, to a country of mountains and mist and cherry blossoms, where the world was once undone and slowly, patiently, made whole again. Close your eyes. Breathe. We are going to Japan. Imagine standing at the edge of a forest at dusk, somewhere in the mountains of central Japan. The year is somewhere in the middle of the 15th century, and the world around you is exquisite in the way that only truly old, deeply storied places can be. The air is cool and carries the smell of cedar and wet stone, of wood smoke rising from a village somewhere down below in the valley. The sky above the ridgeline is the deep bruised blue that comes just after the last light has gone, but before the stars have fully arrived, and in that brief, impossible moment, everything seems very still. A temple bell is ringing somewhere far away, low and resonant, each note hanging in the mountain air a little longer than you would expect, as if the sound itself is reluctant to leave. Below you, if you could see through the trees, you would find a Japan that looks nothing like the one most people imagine today. There are no great glittering cities, no Shinkansen trains threading between glass towers. There are instead fortified hilltop castles with thick earthen walls, their banners snapping in mountain winds. There are rice paddies shining like mirrors in the early morning, and narrow muddy roads between them where farmers and merchants and monks and wandering swordsmen pass each other with careful, measured nods. There are market towns that come alive on certain days of the month, full of noise and colour and the smell of grilled fish and freshly cut wood, and then fall quiet again like a tide going out. This is the Japan of the Sengoku period, the Warring States period, and though its name suggests nothing but violence and chaos, the story of how it began and how it slowly, over more than a century, came to its end, is one of the most remarkable human stories ever told. It is a story about what happens when the old order comes apart, when the people holding the threads of power let them drop, and the threads are gathered up again by hands no one expected. It is a story about ambition, yes, but also about survival, about the strange grace of ordinary people rising to impossible moments, and about the long, slow, aching work of bringing a broken world back together. It will take us some time to tell it properly, and we have all the time we need. There is nowhere to be tonight. There is nothing to do but listen and breathe and let the story carry you. Let's begin at the beginning. For a long time before our story begins, a very long time, stretching back through generations and dynasties and slowly shifting arrangements of power, Japan was governed by a system that everyone understood and almost no one questioned. At the very top of everything sat the emperor, a figure of immense sacred significance, ancient and revered as the divine center of the Japanese world. But the emperor, as a practical matter, did not rule. He blessed, he presided, he gave the whole architecture of governance a kind of cosmic legitimacy, but the actual work of running the country, the armies and the taxes and the laws, that work had long since passed to a figure called the shogun. Think of the shogun as something between a military commander and a prime minister, a man of the highest noble rank who governed in the emperor's name and wielded the real power of the state. For much of the 14th and 15th centuries, the shogunate, the government of the shogun, was held by a family called the Ashikaga. They ruled from the ancient city of Kyoto, surrounded by the refinements of court life, by gardens and poetry, and the slow, elegant ceremonies of aristocratic culture. And for a while, this arrangement worked reasonably well. The Ashikaga shoguns kept the country's powerful regional lords, the daimyo, in a manageable kind of order. The daimyo controlled their provinces, they commanded their samurai, they collected their taxes, they sent representatives to Kyoto and kept their ties to the shogun, and the shogun in turn gave their authority the official sanction it needed to be legitimate. Underneath this structure, though, the roots were quietly weakening. Over the course of the early Ashikaga period, the regional military officials called shugo, the men appointed to maintain order and police the provinces, had been gradually given more and more power. What began as a practical arrangement, local men doing local work, slowly became something else. The shugo grew wealthy. They built relationships with the samurai in their regions, sharing their income, weaving themselves into the local fabric of loyalty and obligation. By the early 1400s, the most powerful of them had become something new, the shugo daimyo, lords in their own right, with their own castles and their own armies, and their own sense of how things ought to be arranged. The Ashikaga shogunate watched this happen and was not strong enough to stop it. And then came a moment, seemingly small, as such moments often are, that cracked the whole structure open. In 1428, the fourth Ashikaga shogun, a man named Yoshimochi, fell gravely ill. The question of who would succeed him became unexpectedly complicated. His son, the fifth shogun Yoshikazu, had already died young, barely 19 years old, and so the shogunate found itself choosing among Yoshimochi's four surviving brothers. To ensure fairness, to prevent any one faction from simply imposing their preferred candidate, the deciding vote was left to chance. A lottery was held, names were written and placed before a shrine, and the lot fell to a man named Ashikaga Yoshinori, the sixth Ashikaga shogun. Yoshinori had not been educated for this role. He had spent his life in a monastery, preparing for a religious life rather than a political one, and the translation from monk to military ruler was not a smooth one. He was temperamental in ways that frightened people, prone to decisions that seemed capricious and cruel, quick to distrust those around him. He accumulated enemies with a kind of careless efficiency, and in 1441 one of those enemies finally acted. A lord named Akamatsu Mitsusuke invited the shogun to his home for a banquet, a perfectly ordinary occasion, the kind of evening that was in every way supposed to be peaceful and pleasant, and during the festivities, Mitsusuke's men killed him. This was the Kakitsu Rebellion, and while the rebellion itself was put down, the damage it did to the idea of shogunal authority could not be undone so easily. A shogun had been murdered by a vassal. The order of things had been violated, and everyone who came after, every lord and soldier and farmer watching from a cautious distance, had seen that the man at the center of power could be reached. The shogunate never fully recovered its sense of invulnerability after that night. Now picture Kyoto, not the quiet, composed city it would eventually become, but Kyoto in the middle of the 15th century, humming with a specific kind of anxiety, a city where powerful men watched each other across banquet tables and whispered in corridors and built alliances that dissolved and reformed like clouds. The eighth Ashikaga shogun, Yoshimasa, was doing his best to hold everything together, and mostly he was failing. He was a man of genuine aesthetic refinement. The garden he built, the silver pavilion, still stands today and is still extraordinary. But refinement is not the same as leadership, and Yoshimasa was, by almost every account, a more capable poet than he was a ruler. He had no sons, so he arranged for his younger brother, Yoshimi, to come and prepare to inherit the shogunate. The succession seemed settled, and then Yoshimasa's wife, a formidable and politically savvy woman named Hino Tomiko, gave birth to a son, Yoshihisa. Suddenly, there were two candidates for the next shogunate, and the powerful men around them, the great shugo daimyo who had been building their strength for decades, began to choose sides. The Hatakeyama clan was already split by its own internal succession dispute. So was the Shiba clan. And two men who were bound by marriage into the same family, Hosokawa Katsumoto and Yamana Sozen, found themselves on opposite sides of every political question, father-in-law and son-in-law pulled in opposite directions by ambition and pride. In 1467, All of this finally broke. The tensions that had been building for years erupted into open war in the streets of Kyoto, and the conflict that began there would carry the name of the era it started in, the Onin War. On one side stood the Eastern Army, led by Hosokawa Katsumoto. On the other, the Western Army, led by Yamana Sozen. Both men were old by the standards of their time, and both men were formidable. They drew to their banners the fractious lords of the Hatakeyama and Shiba clans, each side taking whichever faction of those divided families served their purpose. The armies gathered in Kyoto and began, in the worst possible way, to fight over it. For 10 years this went on, 10 years of armies moving through the streets of what had been one of the most beautiful cities in the world. The fires that broke out during those years consumed temples that had stood for centuries, aristocratic mansions with their treasured gardens, Shinto shrines of profound ancient significance. 2/3 of Kyoto was destroyed. The city that had been the physical and spiritual heart of Japanese civilization was left broken and charred, its streets full of soldiers and refugees, its elegance buried under the debris of prolonged grinding war. In 1473, both Hosokawa Katsumoto and Yamana Sozen died. The two men whose rivalry had ignited the conflict, both gone before it was over, leaving their armies to continue fighting out of momentum and obligation rather than strategy or purpose. The war finally ended in 1477, not with any decisive victory, but with the Western lords simply withdrawing their armies from Kyoto and going home. There was no peace treaty, no transformation, no clear winner, just exhaustion, just the slow deflation of a war that had consumed everything and resolved nothing. But if the war resolved nothing for the lords who fought it, it resolved something much more significant for the country as a whole. It revealed, in the starkest possible terms, that the Ashikaga shogunate no longer controlled Japan. The daimyo, who had been required to maintain residences in Kyoto, who had kept their presence there as a symbolic gesture of fealty to the shogun, left. They went back to their provinces, and when they arrived, many of them discovered that in their absence things had changed. Their deputies, the men they had left behind to manage their domains, had been busy. Some had built their own networks of loyalty. Some had expanded their control. Some had decided, in that quietly decisive way that power vacuums tend to produce, that they were no longer servants. This was the world being remade. This was the Sengoku period beginning. The word Sengoku means something like warring states, and in the century or more that followed the Onin War, Japan was indeed a country of warring states, of daimyo expanding and contracting their territories through battle and diplomacy and betrayal, of alliances formed at one season and broken by the next. The map of Japanese power was redrawn so many times in those generations that it would be almost impossible to capture it in a single image. It was a living thing, constantly shifting, with new forces rising and old names disappearing, and the whole restless drama of human ambition playing out across mountain and valley and coastline. But within all of that turbulence, there were currents worth following. There were stories within the larger story. One of the most important of these is the phenomenon the Japanese came to call Gekkokujo. The word is beautiful in its precision. It means, roughly, the low overcoming the high, the subordinate rising above the lord, the man of humble birth stepping over the man of ancient lineage and seizing the power that the old families could no longer hold. In a stable society, in a society where the arrangements of power are well established and defended, Gekkokujo is almost impossible. A farmer does not become a warlord. A deputy does not depose his lord. The hierarchy holds because everyone with power has an interest in maintaining it, and because the mechanisms of enforcement, armies, laws, customs, social pressure, all work to keep things as they are. But the Sengoku period was not a stable society. It was a society in which the mechanisms of order had broken down, in which the shogun could not protect his daimyo, and the daimyo could not always protect their vassals, in which the question of who held power came down more and more simply to who could hold it. And in that environment, the rules that had once seemed permanent began to feel provisional. A man of low birth, but sharp intelligence and extraordinary will could, if the circumstances were right, accomplish things that would have been unthinkable a generation before. The first notable example of this was a man named Hojo Saun. He had been born to relatively modest circumstances, without the deep ancestral name that the great lords carried, without the generations of accumulated prestige that usually translated into military power. But Hojo Saun was perceptive, and he was patient, and he understood the art of building alliances and taking opportunities. In 1493 he seized power in Izu province, becoming one of the earliest examples in the Sengoku period of a man who had risen purely through his own capability rather than his birth. It was an act that would have been extraordinary in almost any other era of Japanese history, and in this one it was the beginning of a pattern. The Hojo clan that Saun founded went on to become one of the major powers of the Kanto region, the broad, fertile plain around what would eventually become Tokyo, holding their position there for nearly a century. Other examples multiplied around them. The Hosokawa clan, who had been among the most powerful in the land, was gradually displaced by their own subordinates, the Miyoshi. The Toki clan, who had ruled their province for generations, found themselves supplanted by the Saito. Everywhere you looked, the old families were giving way, sometimes slowly, sometimes suddenly, always painfully, to men who had earned their power rather than inherited it. And the farmers and craftsmen and merchants who watched all of this from below, who had always been the foundation upon which the entire aristocratic structure rested, had their own responses to the chaos of the age. Imagine a village in the late 15th century. The rice harvest has come in, and the taxes have been assessed, and the men who have come to collect them carry the banner of a lord who has himself changed 3 times in the past decade, as the daimyo wars swept through and rearranged everything. The farmers watching them arrive have not forgotten the year the harvest failed, when no relief came from the lord whose protection they were paying for. They have not forgotten the soldiers who passed through in the summer and took what they needed. They are patient people, because farming requires patience, requires the long view, requires accepting that you cannot control the rain or the frost. But patience has limits. Throughout the Sengoku period, ordinary people organized. The uprisings they formed were called iki, a word that suggests unity, a coming together. The most powerful of these movements were the Iko-iki, uprisings organized around the true Pure Land sect of Buddhism, a form of faith that had spread through the merchant and farming classes with tremendous force precisely because it offered dignity and hope to people who were usually offered neither. The monks of this sect were not passive figures. They were organizers. They helped communities resist, and when resistance required fighting, they fought. The most extraordinary example was in Kaga Province, where an Iko-iki uprising managed not merely to resist a daimyo, but to actually overthrow one, seizing control of the entire province and holding it for nearly 100 years. Nearly 100 years. For nearly a century, in the middle of the Warring States period, there was a province of Japan governed not by a hereditary lord, but by a coalition of farmers and monks and merchants, maintaining their independence through sheer collective will and organization, while the great warlords of the age battled around them. This is the thing about the Sengoku period that is so easy to miss in the broad sweep of dates and battles and famous names. It was not only a story about warlords, it was a story about everyone. It was a story about a society being taken apart and put back together, and about all the different people who had a hand in that process, from the shogun in his damaged palace to the farmer in his muddy field, each of them navigating the same uncertain world as best they could. Now, the light is softening. The noise of battle, the broad, turbulent sweep of those early decades, begins to settle. And from the middle of the 16th century, three figures emerge who will gradually, painfully, over decades of effort and sacrifice and extraordinarily hard work, begin to bring the pieces back together. They are remembered today as the three great unifiers, and each of them is a completely different kind of man. The first is Oda Nobunaga. Picture him as a young man in the 1550s, the lord of a small domain in Owari Province, in the rough middle of the main island of Honshu. He was the son of a clan that had itself risen through the kind of subordinate displacement that characterized the age. The Oda had supplanted the Shiba clan, who had once been their lords. He was not impressive in the ways that mattered in traditional samurai culture. He was unconventional in his dress, deliberately casual in a way that shocked his retainers. He was known to walk through the streets of his town eating food with his hands, laughing loudly, talking to common people with an informality that aristocrats found appalling. But Oda Nobunaga's mind was extraordinary. He had the capacity to look at a problem, any problem, military, logistical, political, and see it with a clarity that most of his contemporaries lacked entirely. He understood that the age of individual samurai heroics, the old idea of war as a matter of personal honor and individual combat, was over. The future of warfare was organization, discipline, numbers, and above all, the ruthless application of new technology. The Portuguese had brought firearms to Japan in 1543, just over a decade before Nobunaga came to prominence, and while most Japanese lords treated these strange imported weapons with a mixture of curiosity and contempt beneath the dignity of a proper warrior, Nobunaga embraced them with characteristic directness. He understood immediately what guns meant. They meant that the training and lineage that had always defined a samurai's worth could be matched and exceeded by a large number of men with relatively simple weapons, trained in organized formation, operating together. This was not a romantic idea. It was a coldly practical one. He built his army around this insight. He drilled his men in disciplined rotation so that one rank could fire while another reloaded, creating a continuous volley that no cavalry charge could break. He won battles with this technique that should, by the old calculations of war, have been impossible for a force his size to win. In 1568, Oda Nobunaga marched on Kyoto. The ancient capital, still scarred from the Onin War nearly a century before, still bearing the marks of all the subsequent decades of neglect and instability, received him. He entered the city not as a conqueror exactly, but as a restorer, presenting himself as the force that would finally bring order back to the country that the Ashikaga shogunate had failed to govern. He established a new political order in the capital, one centered on himself rather than on the old shogunal family, though he was careful enough in his management of symbolism to initially claim he was acting on behalf of the last Ashikaga shogun, Yoshiaki. This, too, would eventually fall away. By 1573, when Nobunaga finally expelled Yoshiaki from Kyoto, the Muromachi shogunate, the Ashikaga shogunate, officially ended. Over 2 centuries of a political order dissolved, a new era beginning. Nobunaga continued his campaigns, pushing outward from Kyoto, subduing one daimyo after another, bringing larger and larger portions of Japan under his control. He was not a gentle man. He was capable of extraordinary cruelty, and some of his campaigns, particularly those against the religious communities that had built their own power bases during the Sengoku period, were conducted with a ferocity that disturbed even his own supporters. The great Buddhist complex at Mount Hiei, which had been a center of learning and religious life for centuries, was burned on his orders. Thousands died. He justified these actions in the language of necessity, of order, of the claim that only by destroying the old powers completely could a new unified Japan be built. Whether that justification was sincere or convenient is a question that historians have argued about ever since. What is certain is that by the early 1580s, Nobunaga controlled more of Japan than any single lord had controlled in over a century. And then, on an early summer night in June of 1582, in the city of Kyoto, at a temple called Honnoji, everything changed. One of Nobunaga's most trusted generals, a man named Akechi Mitsuhide, surrounded the temple with his army. Nobunaga was there with only a small personal retinue, no expectation of danger. Mitsuhide was his general, his trusted lieutenant, a man who had served him for years with great skill. The reasons for what Mitsuhide did that night have been debated for over 400 years and have never been satisfactorily resolved. He left no clear record of his motivations. Perhaps there had been a humiliation, some slight or cruelty that had finally become unbearable. Perhaps there was a calculation, an assessment that with Nobunaga gone, power could be seized. Perhaps something else entirely, something lost to time. But the attack came, and Nobunaga, surrounded and outnumbered, knowing there was no escape, set fire to the temple himself and died inside it. The man who had come closer than anyone in a century to unifying Japan was gone, at 50 years old, in a matter of hours. Akechi Mitsuhide's reign as the dominant power in Japan lasted exactly 13 days. Within less than 2 weeks of the Honnoji incident, Nobunaga's most capable general, a man who was born a peasant and whose name had been given to him because he had none of his own, had moved with almost impossible speed to confront Mitsuhide. He made peace with an enemy he had been fighting, turned his army around, marched them across the country at a pace that astounded everyone, and met Mitsuhide's forces at a place called Yamazaki. The battle was quick and decisive. Mitsuhide fled and was killed within days of his defeat, and now the second of the great unifiers stepped fully into the light. Toyotomi Hideyoshi. The story of Hideyoshi's life is one that the Japanese have been telling each other for 400 years, and the reason they keep telling it, the reason it retains its power, is that it seems almost impossible. He was born in a village in Owari Province, the same province where Nobunaga had built his early power, in approximately 1537. His father was a farmer, a foot soldier of no particular rank. The family had no name that mattered, no land, no standing. Hideyoshi as a child was, by every measure of the society he was born into, nobody. He was physically unprepossessing, short, thin, with features that earned him the nickname Saru, the monkey, though no one said it to his face after he became powerful. He had no formal martial training, no ancestral sword, no family crest. What he had was an intelligence that was almost supernatural in its quickness, an ability to read people and situations and to know instinctively what to do and say and offer to get what he wanted. He had charm of the most penetrating kind, the kind that makes people feel seen and understood, that makes even great men feel appreciated rather than condescended to. And he had energy, a relentless, tireless, almost inhuman energy. He found his way into Nobunaga's service as a young man, starting in the most menial roles possible, carrying sandals, managing firewood, and rising, slowly at first, and then with accelerating speed, as the quality of his mind made itself impossible to ignore. Nobunaga, who was not a man who suffered incompetence, promoted him again and again. By the time he was a seasoned general, Hideyoshi had command of armies, governed territories, conducted diplomatic negotiations. He had risen from the very bottom to within touching distance of the very top. After Yamazaki, after the death of Mitsuhide, he rose higher still. With Nobunaga gone and no obvious successor in place, Nobunaga's sons were available but young and untested. Hideyoshi moved with the same speed he had shown in his military campaigns. He organized a council, managed the politics of succession with breathtaking skill, and emerged from the subsequent negotiations in the dominant position. By 1585, he had been appointed Kampaku, imperial regent, the highest civil office in Japan. A peasant who had been born with no surname was now, in the fullest and most official sense, the most powerful man in the country. Think about that for a moment. Let it settle. In the world that existed before the Sengoku period, this would have been not merely unusual, but categorically impossible. The concept did not have room for it. The social order was the social order, and the idea that a man born to farmers with no family name could become the imperial regent of Japan would have been received as a kind of cosmic joke. But the Sengoku period had taken the old order apart, piece by piece, for a century, and in the space that opened up, a man like Hideyoshi could exist, could rise, could become what he became. He continued Nobunaga's project of unification with his own particular style, less brutally direct than his predecessor, more willing to negotiate, more subtle in his use of politics alongside military force. He brought the great Western lords into submission through a combination of military pressure and skillful diplomacy, offering terms that let them keep their dignity while accepting his supremacy. By the late 1580s, he controlled most of Japan. When he finally subdued the Hojo clan in the Kanto region in 1590, seizing their great castle at Odawara after a siege that lasted months, the unification of Japan was essentially complete. The final years of Hideyoshi's life were complicated by two failed invasions of Korea, ambitious and ultimately disastrous campaigns that consumed enormous resources and lives and left a shadow over his legacy. He died in 1598, with his heir Toyotomi Hideyoshi only 5 years old, and the political settlement he had built began immediately to tremble. It was now the third man's turn, the last of the three great unifiers, the one who would prove most durable of all. Tokugawa Ieyasu was older than Hideyoshi by 6 years, and in many ways he was the most patient man in a story filled with patient men. He had been a hostage as a child, held by rival clans as a guarantee of his family's loyalty, an experience that must have taught him, at the deepest level, the value of survival, of enduring whatever was necessary, of keeping your eyes on the long horizon, even when everything in the present was uncertain and frightening. He had served Nobunaga as an ally, had managed his own eastern territories with great skill, had watched Hideyoshi's rise with a careful attention that never quite became either rivalry or submission. After Hideyoshi's death, the council of regents he had established to govern on behalf of young Hideyori began to fracture. Ieyasu was the most powerful figure on the council, and he began to build alliances and redistribute power in ways that alarmed the others. Two factions formed. One, loyal to the Toyotomi cause and Hideyori's claim, organized under a brilliant administrator named Ishida Mitsunari. The other gathered around Ieyasu. For 2 years the tension built, the way storms build over warm ocean water in summer, slowly at first, then with increasing urgency. And then, on the morning of October 21st in the year 1600, in a valley in Mino province, at a place called Sekigahara, the two forces met. The morning was foggy. A heavy autumn mist had settled into the valley from earlier rains, the kind of thick, wet fog that turns the world into shapes and suggestions, that makes distances impossible to judge and familiar things strange. Tokugawa's advance guard moved into the valley and almost stumbled into Ishida's army before either side was ready. Both forces panicked briefly and withdrew, reorganizing themselves in the fog, each now fully aware that the reckoning had arrived. The armies arrayed themselves across the valley floor. Ieyasu's eastern forces and Mitsunari's western coalition faced each other across a narrow space, both sides knowing that what happened in the next few hours would determine the shape of Japan for generations. Last-minute orders were issued. Commanders made the final adjustments to their positions. And then, around mid-morning, it began. The first blow was struck by Inaomasa, one of Ieyasu's most celebrated commanders, who led his famous unit, 3,600 soldiers in crimson armor, known as I's Red Devils, into the center of the Western Army's formation. They crashed forward into the enemy lines,
and the battle that followed was the kind of battle that becomes legendary precisely because of what it decided. It was large and chaotic and brutal, men pushing against each other in the valley mist, arquebus fire cracking through the fog, arrows arcing overhead. Historians reconstructing it from the records have noted that it likely remained deadlocked for a significant portion of the morning. And then the defections began. Several commanders who had nominally aligned themselves with the Western Army had made prior arrangements with Ieyasu. At the crucial moment, they turned. One significant coalition that had been sitting on a ridge above the battlefield, expected to support Mitsunari, simply did not move. The Western coalition began to crumble. Within hours, what had been an uncertain battle was becoming a rout. Mitsunari fled. His allies either surrendered or attempted to escape. Ieyasu, sitting on his camp stool in the middle of his army as the reports came in, gave the orders that consolidated his victory. By the end of that October day, the battle was over. The Sengoku period, the age that had begun in the halls and streets of Kyoto over a century before with the quarrels of lords and the ambitions of powerful men, was essentially over too. 3 years later, in 1603, Tokugawa Ieyasu was appointed shogun by the emperor. He was 60 years old. He had waited for this his entire life, had survived captivity and war and the rise and fall of two men more famous than himself, had watched the Sengoku period burn through its generations, and had simply outlasted it, patient and calculating and formidably intelligent. The Tokugawa shogunate he established that year would last for over 2.5 centuries, an era of stability and consolidation so thorough that some later historians would find it almost suffocating, but which gave Japan a long peace after the long war of the Sengoku years. The age of warring states had ended, but the stories remained. They remained in the great castles that the daimyo had built during those years, many of which still stand today, their white plastered walls rising above their stone foundations with a composure that seems almost miraculous given the turbulence that surrounded their construction. They remained in the traditions of martial arts that had been refined and codified during those generations of conflict, and in the arts that had paradoxically flourished alongside the fighting, the tea ceremony, the development of the no drama, the refinement of garden design, all of which reached new heights during the very period when the country was most at war with itself. Perhaps there is something in that combination, art deepening alongside conflict, that tells us something true about human beings. They remained too in the memories of the men and women who had lived through them, the samurai who had risen from common origins and fought their way to prominence, the farmers who had organized their villages into something like self-governance for a century in Kaga Province, the craftsmen and merchants who had rebuilt Kyoto from its ruins, quietly and patiently, brick by beam by tile, reclaiming each street and neighborhood from the rubble of the Onin War. The children who had grown up in a world of constant uncertainty and had somehow, most of them, found a way to live and love and plant their fields and watch the seasons turn. The stories remained in the legendary figures. In Nobunaga, brilliant and ferocious, striding forward into the future with both hands. In Hideyoshi, the Monkey King, the nobody who became everything, whose life was the most complete argument the Sengoku period ever made for the proposition that the world could be remade by sheer human will. In Ieyasu, the great waiter, the man who had the wisdom to understand that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply endure, to stay alive and present and ready until the moment that is yours finally arrives. And in the smaller figures too, in Akechi Mitsuhide, whose 13 days of power have made him one of the most debated men in Japanese history, the general who killed his lord for reasons no one has ever been able to fully explain, whose brief and catastrophic reign gave the Japanese language a phrase for any short-lived moment of glory. In the monks of the true Pure Land sect who organized the farmers of Kaga into a century-long experiment in self-rule. In Hojo Soun, the first man to prove that the old categories of birth and lineage could be transcended, opening the door through which Hideyoshi would eventually walk all the way to the top of the world. The Sengoku period was many things. It was terrible, of course. A century of war is terrible, and the suffering it produced was real and enormous and affected millions of people whose names we will never know. But it was also, in its turbulent and exhausting way, a period of tremendous human possibility, a period in which the fixed arrangements of power were shown to be unfixed, in which the stories people told themselves about who could rise and who could not were revised from the bottom up, in which the ordinary and the extraordinary came together in ways that the more settled centuries before and after never quite managed. It was a period in which Japan was remade, and it took over a century, and it took 3 remarkable men working across 3 generations, and it took the Iko-Iki farmers of Kaga and the loyal retainers who stood at the gates of castles through long cold sieges, and the craftsmen who rebuilt Kyoto stone by stone, and it took every anonymous soldier and monk and merchant and wandering swordsman who passed along those narrow muddy roads between the rice paddies under skies that were sometimes blue and sometimes full of smoke. And now the story is told. The mountains of Japan are quiet tonight. The cedar forests are dark and still, and the only sound is the wind moving through them with the patient, unhurried voice that wind has in forests, not caring about centuries or dynasties or the great drama of human ambition, simply moving, simply being. Somewhere far below the ridgeline, in a village that has been rebuilt and rebuilt and rebuilt across the centuries, a single lamp is burning. Through a paper screen its light is warm and amber. A child is asleep. An old man is writing. A kettle is warming over coals. The temple bell has rung its last ring of the evening. The sound of it has travelled out across the valley and been absorbed by distance and darkness and the soft give of the autumn air. The great lords are at peace now. Nobunaga and Hideyoshi and Ieyasu, who between them put the world back together, have been at rest for 4 centuries. The castles they built and fought over still stand on their hilltops, white and composed and very beautiful, looking out over the same mountains and rivers they always looked out over, unchanged by the passage of all those human years. Akechi Mitsuhide, too, is at peace, whatever drove him to that night at Honnoji, whatever grief or calculation or sudden breaking point sent his army around the walls of that temple. It is long resolved now, dissolved into history, into the stories people still quietly tell. The farmers of Kaga Province who held their independence for 100 years, who organized themselves against the order of things and made something remarkable in the space the chaos opened, they are at peace too, and what they built, the memory of it, is part of what the Sengoku period gave to the world, the knowledge that ordinary people, given the necessity and the will, are capable of more than anyone expects. Let all of that settle now. Let the valley of Sekigahara rest in its autumn mist. Let the fog roll in gently, the way it did on that October morning in 1600, softening the edges of everything, muffling the distances, turning the world into a soft and shifting landscape where the sharp lines between things dissolve and everything becomes, for a little while, simply quiet, simply still. You have travelled a long way tonight, across an ocean and across centuries and through a story that held the full measure of human life, its ambition and its cruelty, its extraordinary capability and its patient hope. You have stood at the edge of cedar forests at dusk and listened to temple bells. You have looked out over rice paddies shining like mirrors in the early light. You have seen the white walls of mountain castles catching the last of the afternoon sun. Let all of that rest inside you now, like something warm and comfortable, like the weight of a good blanket, like the particular silence that comes after a story has been told well and received well, when both the teller and the listener can feel it settling into the space between them. The lamp behind the paper screen is burning lower now. The old man has put down his brush. The child hasn't stirred. The wind moves through the cedar forest with the slow, indifferent grace of something that has been doing this since long before the first castle was built, and will still be doing it long after the last stone has gone back to earth. Let your breathing slow to match it, slow and even, like the forest wind, in and out, in and out. There is nowhere to be. There is nothing left to do tonight except let the story carry you the rest of the way, down into the deep and quiet dark, where all the stories finally go, where all the lords and generals and farmers and monks are resting, where the long turbulent centuries of the Sengoku period have finally, gently, come to rest. Sleep now. The mountains of Japan are keeping watch.